I call the member David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to take a call on this bill, in part to have an opportunity to explain why the Greens initially did support this bill through to Select Committee, and indeed I personally participated in that committee. But at this stage we're no longer able to support the bill for reasons that I'll go into, and indeed for reasons that have not very different from some that have been expressed by other members. Sir, in part we supported the bill initially due to the sheer enthusiasm of the member who at that stage brought the bill into the House. I'm grateful to Mr Paraoni for pointing out that the bill has a somewhat longer history than I was aware of. But Mrs Asanati Lole Taylor brought this bill in with real passion, with real concern, and that genuine concern, the intention of the bill was very honest and appropriate, and we certainly supported that. And on the face of it was a very straightforward bill to make the presence of children in the presence of offending an aggravating factor at sentencing. It seemed a good enough idea, certainly, to put our support through. It's well known, sir, that children are often the unseen victims of crime. That the fact is that there are significant. The bill itself notes that criminal offending often exposes minors to serious harm, and that harm can be physical, it can be emotional, it can be psychological, and it can cause lifelong problems for young children as they grow. It can affect their development seriously. It can create all sorts of effectively the form of post-traumatic stress sort of symptoms that children can exhibit. At the extreme end, of course, offending inevitably can lead to imprisonment. We know that it is extremely damaging for children to have a parent in prison. We know that the likelihood of a child with a parent in prison, that the likelihood is that those children are something like 7 times more likely to end up in the justice system or in prison themselves. And I think we have to be alert to the extreme necessity of keeping our children out of those situations. I will make a completely gratuitous, unsolicited plug for Pillars, the organisation Christchurch-based and also with a facility in Manukau City, who engage with the children of prisoners and do extraordinarily good work to help support those children, their families, while they have a parent in jail. But sir, so this, it was clear in the explanatory note to the bill that while the bill talked about offences committed in the presence of children or minors, the specific focus was on children who were caught up in P-labs and situations where methamphetamine was being manufactured or used, but even manufactured. And that's an appalling neglect of any sort of responsibility, be it parental or any other sort, to allow a child to be in that very dangerous environment. So the numbers of, sadly we know that the numbers of homes and sites where P with methamphetamine is cooked or manufactured is quite a frightening number. Some work done by the Homeowners and Buyers Association about 2 years ago indicated there could be something in excess of 30,000 houses in New Zealand that have been or are being used for manufacture of methamphetamine. We know that's extraordinarily dangerous because the chemicals used in the manufacture are in themselves very toxic. They get disposed of inappropriately, tipped down drains, poured into gardens. Equally and even more insidious, some of the organic the chemicals that gas out, the gases that are a result of the cooking of P, will be absorbed into just about any sort of porous material, be it carpets, be it soft furnishings, even plasterboards, even unsealed concrete can absorb these gases, and over time they gas out. And so anybody living in those environments can be exposed to those gases, and there are significant health risks associated with that. Asthma symptoms, breathing difficulties, skin rashes, eye irritation, right through to much more serious diseases of the central nervous system, strokes and cancers can all be directly linked to the presence of these chemicals in homes. And so getting back to the bill, the intention of the bill was to try and ensure that children were not exposed to these very, very dangerous substances, and of course one would always wish that children were not put into those dangerous situations. most of us would go to extraordinary lengths and do to make our homes safe and hazard-free for children. I recently had the pleasure of having my toddler granddaughters at home for a few days, and you discover very quickly that just a normal family home is abundant with hazards for children, very active kids of that age, be it sharp edges, electrical items, heat sources, fragile ornaments, you name it, kids will find it. Most of us do endeavour to make our homes and our environments child-friendly, child-safe. It's very sad that there are people in our community who lack the empathy, the common sense, the concern, who are reckless enough to expose children to these extraordinarily dangerous situations, as in a pea house or somewhere where these dreadful chemicals are being used carelessly and without thought for the well-being of those kids. So having said that, we regret we can't support this bill because it was well-intentioned. It did reveal a very real risk and an important problem. But clearly, well, primarily the reason we're not supporting this bill further is that we've been persuaded by the select committee process, by the advice from the officials, and by evidence that the legislation simply is not necessary. We were shown judgments, quotes, extracts from judgments, where it was clear that judges did consider the presence of children where offending was taking place as an aggravating factor, and it did influence their thinking when it came to sentencing. We were persuaded that the legislation for that reason was unnecessary. There were also issues about the wording of the bill, about the definitions, particularly the phrase "in the presence of," which seems sensible and straightforward. But it was revealed to us by officials and others that to say that if an offence was in the presence of minor, it wasn't clear what the boundaries of that were. Common sense, you would say, if the children were in that house, in that building, whatever it might be. But legally, it could mean that even if there were children in a nearby building or in the street or in a mall or anywhere, any public place, it could still be captured by this legislation, which was outside the intention of it clearly. But it seemed that there was no clean way or no effective way to tighten up that definition sufficiently so that the intention of the bill would be made more clear. The notion of proximity is one that legally has issues with it. There was also concern that putting these provisions into the primary legislation, the amendments to endeavour to capture the notion that where offending was happening in the presence of children, that sentencing should acknowledge that. There were issues around judicial discretion, the fact that you actually might be locking judges into outcomes or to making judgments that were less than optimal. There could be situations where you would not necessarily want to have that level of direct influence to impose those conditions or those restrictions on the judges. And so while clearly we have absolutely no tolerance for anyone who would offend in the presence of children, who would put children at risk or minors at risk, we would particularly have no time for people who are engaging in cooking meth with obviously driven only by a profit motive. I think just as an aside to that, it's interesting that some of the gangs even will not allow their own members to use this drug because it's just such a volatile, dangerous substance to absorb, albeit unfortunately some of those same gangs might be involved in the business around it. But sir, we cannot and would not ever condone any form of endangerment of children by putting them into a situation where offending is taking place. But for all its good intentions and its apparent simplicity, sir, we have been persuaded through the select committee process that it's not necessary, that there is existing law in place. Jacinda Ardern made some very interesting points about the fact that there actually isn't a criminal offence that captures the notion of people actually committing these acts, particularly cooking drugs in the presence of children, and maybe that's an avenue that might be worth exploring at a later time. But as I say, for all that we do acknowledge and respect the intention of the legislation, the Greens will not be supporting it further. Thank you.